Okay, so I'm working on the Conspiracy and Democracy project, and the particular theme that I'm working on is transparency and suspicion of democracy. And I guess the basic sort of intuition behind this part of the project is that over the last 30 or 40 years, many advanced democracies have instituted all sorts of policies and practices of openness and transparency. And there have also been some uncontrolled advances in transparency through WikiLeaks and the spread of information technologies. And we have this odd situation where, on the one hand, we find that the levels of sort of corruption in advanced democracies are actually strikingly low, and yet suspicion in democracies, suspicion and mistrust, is stubbornly high. So this kind of gives a puzzle, right? Which is, does transparency generate suspicion of democracy? And if so, is that a good thing for democracy? And democratic theorists usually sort of say yes and yes. Basically, more transparency does generate suspicion of democracy, and that's a good thing. So, people will say the whole of the story of liberal democracy has been the institutionalization of forms of mistrust into government. The only reason government is tolerably in line with the public interest is because there is such organized mistrust of government. So, Jeremy Bentham used to say that transparency was the enemy, or that openness was the enemy of secrecy and the enemy of conspiracy, and that you should always be maximally open in government. And John Stuart Mill, very famously, had the idea that if politicians were forced to be publicly accountable, to have to account for themselves, then they would act in ways that would be easier to justify in public. There have also been many arguments that transparency can break up monopolies on information, and in various ways, basically, transparency sort of invigorates democracy. So suspicion invigorates democracy. So that's one sort of long line of democratic thought. But there are also some theorists who have reservations, right, and who recognize, for example, the value of secrecy in democracy, and that there are some things that in fact have to be secret, and that you can't always have secrecy and accountability at the same time, or you can't have the functions that you need from administration. Sometimes you need to be secret to do your job well. And other theorists have pointed out that deliberation, like policy deliberation, actually goes better behind closed doors. That often it's not very helpful to have to think about policy alternatives in the glare of publicity. And still others. One philosopher once wrote about transparency. He said it's like pulling up a plant every 5 minutes to check whether its roots are growing, right? So saying that institutional life doesn't flourish when we're constantly scrutinizing it, that there needs to be, that it's a sort of displacement of trust. So on this sort of reading, suspicion of democracy and the kind of transparency generates suspicion of democracy, and it kind of enervates or undermines democratic government. So that's the sort of background puzzle that I'm working with. And then I suppose one of my questions then is sort of, on one hand, how and why has this language of transparency and openness in government become so prevalent and so well established over the last 30 or 40 years? So it's this very natural and obvious thing. But I want to look more particularly at how that happened and what exactly it entails. Particularly, I want to look at continuities. What kind of continuities and differences are there with older forms and ideals of accountability? What's new? I have a kind of hunch that one of the things that's new is an idea of openness of information and a sort of democratic ideal of collective wisdom through making information open. But that's something I'd want to explore a little more closely. Also, I have a sort of hunch that there's an ideal. There's a sort of an ideal that, rather like the way informed consumers are supposed to constrain businesses, and informed citizens are supposed to constrain governments. So there's a similar market mechanism. So that's one sort of line of thought. And another is just to look at the different sorts of mechanisms of transparency, the different sorts of ways in which governments might be said to be transparent, and look at their democratic effects. So really, in this larger Conspiracies and Democracies project, this is my project is directed more to this contemporary problem of transparency and suspicion. It links back to the Conspiracy and Democracy project in as much as transparency is often considered the answer or the solution to conspiracy. If you want to stop conspiracy, you need to be more transparent, you need to be more open. So, it would be important if there's some serious democratic ambivalence about the ideal of transparency itself.